Hi, everyone. It's Karen, and welcome to the Divine Healthy Living Show. Today, we're doing something a little bit different. I'm very excited about it, both because it's part of my personal journey and then is recovering from PTSD. So I want all of you to know that suffer with chronic depression, anxiety, stress, could be PTSD. It even looks like ADHD. Yes, ADHD, because of what happens with the brain. But God wants you to heal. He intends you to heal. He intends for you to live in shalom, which is his abundance, his wholeness, relationally, physically, spiritually, emotionally, in every way. It's God's total abundance. So I want to welcome today. Donna will be back next week. We'll be picking up the talk next week on cleanses and whether or not you should do a cleanse that puts your body into crisis, or does a gentle cleanse work? There's a lot of discussion on that online. Isn't there always discussion online? But today with me is Mel Mossberger. She is a licensed professional therapist, or is it a licensed clinical therapist?
Yeah, licensed professional counselor.
There you go, licensed professional counselor who specializes in trauma healing and recovery. And she is, we're going to be talking today with Mel about the body work side of trauma recovery, which is really just almost, Mel, how long have people been talking about body recovery in trauma?
Ages.
Ages?
Yes, really. And I think more recently than before. I think once we surpassed the taboo of like mental health, and now we're kind of turning this era of understanding it's like a biopsychosocial model beyond just like the mental component, but that the body definitely like carries some of these traumas, anxieties, depression, all the above.
Wow. So thank you so much for being here today and sharing this with us. What got you interested in trauma as something you wanted to work with?
Yeah, so I'm a big believer that although we might have an idea of what we'd like to do, we may not always know the exact plan. I mean, I think a lot of us can relate to that. And so I knew that I wanted to be in the field of psychology, and my journey really began going to school. And once I got my bachelor's in psychology, it's like, okay, well, what can I actually do with this? Unfortunately, with a bachelor's in psychology, you can't do much in the field of psychology. But my requirement for my bachelor's degree was to go and do an internship. And I was very blessed and fortunate to have been able to do an internship in Paris, France.
Wow.
For 3 months. And so while I was there on my own, through an organization, but on my own, I befriended people all around me. And I frequented a Starbucks in Paris. And one of those people that I befriended there became a really good friend of mine. And through our conversations of coffee, it just developed into a friendship. And one day in that conversation, when we were having, I was just listening to her heart and what was going on in her life. I really felt that God was saying, hey, this is what I want you to do. I want you to empower young adult women and build up their self-esteem. It was as if there was like those angels singing this, oh.
Wow. Right.
And so after that internship was done, I came back to the United States. I was working at an ophthalmologist office, just checking people in. And I said, okay, God, what does this mean? What are my next steps? And unfortunately to me, it meant going back to school. So I went back to grad school. I said, okay, God, if this is what, the next step, then you're going to help me with these grades. And he did. And so when I got into that graduate program, that's where I really got exposed to all kinds of trauma trainings. And that began the journey for trauma for me. And I got a certification through the Green Cross. The Green Cross is for medical crisis and emergency, with related to mental health.
So if I can just do it, you said something though, and I'd like to have you just, if you could address it, the connection between low self-esteem and trauma. Because one of the functions of trauma is this overriding sense of shame. Yeah. And I think the shame comes in part from the loss of personal agency. Agency means I can impact the world around me. I can control aspects of my life that should be mine to control.
Yeah.
And trauma strips that away.
Sure.
Big time. So how does self-esteem and trauma, how are they connected?
I mean,
Self-esteem.
a big part of it is an identity. At the core of it, with self-esteem, it's who am I as a result of what's happened? Who was I before then, and who I am now? Am I an overcomer? Nowadays it's also very important to use accurate language. And I find myself having to redefine that as I'm speaking to people when I have individuals that I come across who have, for example, been a victim of sexual abuse or sexual assault. Now we have this language of you're not necessarily a victim, you're a survivor. So just even switching those words creates a switch in your mental psyche about like, hey, it's not something that just happened to me, but here I am today sitting across from you, telling you my story. And through telling you my story, I'm empowering myself. I'm allowing somebody else in. I'm trusting somebody else in. And through that, I'm working on my self-esteem. I'm building that up again. So I think a big part of it is also like, what's that language that we use in regards to what has happened to us?
Right. And just a quick thing on the sexual assault. I was listening to a missionary who's now with the Lord, and she had been sexually assaulted as part of her mission work repeatedly, multiple times. So just as a word that she said it, I had never thought about this way. She said, they could maybe impact my mind.
Yeah.
They could impact my body, but they didn't get my spirit.
Amen.
My spirit. So just those of you, as you're coming through trauma of any kind.
This gives me goosebumps.
Yeah. It doesn't, it's not about your spirit.
Yeah.
Your spirit will overcome, your soul will be healed, your mind will be healed, and your body will be healed. I think that's really, really important, because one of the things trauma does is it lies. Trauma says what you've experienced is now the defining moment of your life. No, it's not.
Sure.
It's a milestone, perhaps, a pivot point, perhaps, but it's not the defining moment of your life. It doesn't have to be. Can you talk about that just for a minute before we get into some of the body therapies that you work with?
Yeah, it's a perspective. Am I going to overcome this? Am I going to be defined by this? Do I choose to be defined by something that happened to me, whether it was voluntary, involuntary, against your will, or you were willing? Am I going to choose? How are you going to be defined by this moment? So if you do allow it to be a defining moment, how is it going to define you? And don't get me wrong, I have had people walking in my door 20 years after the traumatic situation happened, because it can take that long for somebody to be ready to face the fear of going through and walking in that pain for just even a little bit. I think that's what holds people back, is thinking that they're going to be stuck in that fear or stuck in the crying, but they're not. You're not going to be in that moment. You got to go through that, and then you'll walk around the other side, and you won't have to keep re-experiencing that moment again. So
I want to talk about that just a little bit, because part of the body work that you do as part of healing, taking someone on a healing, does not require re-experiencing the emotion. And the thing with trauma, because the brain loops through the event, and part of the brain loop and the constant thinking and the intrusive thoughts is your brain instinctively is going, what if I had just done this? Would it have resolved? And you're trying to, in your mind, change what cannot be changed because it's now in the past. But every time you do that, you re-experience it fresh. So even though it's been 20 years, it was like yesterday, especially when you're triggered. And that is part of the lie of trauma. I think the other lie of trauma is that even if I'm healed, and they make movies about this, I've lost the love of my life, I'm never fully recovered, even though I've moved on. There's always no, it doesn't have to. You might have a scar. Somebody once described it to me this way. I thought it was brilliant. She said, have you ever had a scar and you look at it and you remember the event, but you don't feel the pain anymore? The scar doesn't hurt anymore. It's now just, if you will, a mark, a part of a story. So healing, when we say healing, we mean full, complete. Even if there's a trigger, the trigger is quickly or relatively simply managed. So when we're talking about it, so can we talk about, and I hope I'm not moving too quickly.
Oh, no, this is great. Yeah.
Okay, fantastic. let's talk about some of the therapies that you employ that don't require, because I think if somebody even comes in for that, they feel much more confident about maybe having to look at something that might be painful if
Sure.
they know some of the ways they can heal is removing the body's memory of it. Talk a little bit about body memory, and then just let's talk about EMDR after you talk about body memory.
Yeah, I want to pull from what you were mentioning earlier in terms of not having to go through the experience again, because I think that's one of the things that holds people back from the recovery process is the fear of going through that experience again. And unfortunately, what happens is when you're constantly faced with a trigger and you haven't resolved that trauma, you are constantly re-experiencing that. But here in the context of therapy, there are other modalities or other approaches, as you were mentioning, in ways that you can process it without having to necessarily feel like you're there in the moment. And that looks like, for example, EMDR. And with that, it's a beautiful to see like develop right before your eyes, because the person is allowing their brain to do the work and not necessarily having to recount all the details. I'm not sitting here writing all the details of what happened. Their brain knows, hey, this is the memory that happened on that specific situation. You don't even have to share that specific situation if it's too uncomfortable. And then your brain will do the work. So it stems from this bilateral reprocessing, whether it's
stop. Bilateral means both sides of the brain, right?
So that's where I was going to go into that. Yep. I'm going to break it down for you because it's really quite simple. And I'll give you an example of how I share with people with bilateral stimulation. It's just your brain consists of two hemispheres, left and right. And so when we process information, you're communicating to both sides of the brain. So here's the example. When you're talking to somebody on the phone, sometimes you might notice that people pace around the room. And what do you do when you're pacing around the room? You're walking left to right, left to right. And then you're sitting here listening to the person, and then you give them feedback after you've heard them, and you might continue to walk left to right. And that's what you're doing. You're actually processing what they're saying while you're pacing around the room. So that's the same thing with EMDR, is you're looking either a couple of options. You're looking at someone moving their hand from left to right, or you might have some little buzzers or tappers in your hand that buzz in your palm from left to right, or even more simple. If we're even doing this virtually via telehealth, I'll be tapping over here on my desk from left to right while they're tapping on the tops of their knees from left to right and left to right. So that bilateral stimulation creates that reprocessing in your brain that's similar to what we call REM sleep. So when we're sleeping, I don't know if you've ever noticed when someone's taking a nap and their eyelids are closed, their eyes are actually moving rapidly left to right, left to right. And so that's the same effect that's going on with the reprocessing part in EMDR.
So what is the goal? So the person's kind of coming up with that memory. They're doing the processing, and then what's happening? I know it removes the pain, and it removes, if you will, the power of the memory.
Sure. So I like to paint the picture of one or two scenarios. You're either sitting back and watching the movie of your life unfold, and this movie of your life, just like any other movie, has all these scenes that go by. Or another scenario is like you're sitting in a train and you're looking out the window and you're watching the scenes of what's going on outside the window. And just as quickly as these scenes come, they also go. So you start with one event that's triggering, for example, and your brain will take it to wherever else it needs to go. Whether that's something that happened, related to that, or maybe unrelated. Your brain's doing the healing by taking you to those points of that need to be resolved. Maybe some even areas you don't even know that are there that need to be resolved. I like to call those maybe like the cobwebs that we need to dust off that we haven't even been paying attention to because we've just been surviving, but they're still there. And our body knows that we need to kind of work through that. So what happens after several of these rounds of bilateral stimulation from this original event, your brain is now deducing, okay, that experience is in the past. Or I am confident. Here's where that self-esteem part comes into play. Like I did do the best that I could, or I am doing the best that I can. And you start empowering yourself with looking at that experience as what it was in the past and not in the present. and you're not currently feeling it in your body or even just experiencing it anymore, because you're able to identify that's the shift that happens, that it's no longer the current experience that you're presently like going through, that it's an experience from the past.
Excellent. And I think the more that you do that, again, I think one of the things for a long time, and again, this gets reinforced in movies and novels as people have been trying to deal with trauma without this is a useful form of labels. We know what it is. We know what we're looking at, right? It's not about defining or judging someone. It's about really a right name.
Sure.
And then that gives us oftentimes the right tools and the right path. But with trauma, we didn't really see it. I'm not a researcher, but as somebody who's worked through her own lifelong PTSD, and praise God, I'm healed, is that brain trauma is now looked at as a brain injury, that emotional trauma, because they can now see, because of these brain scans, that there's been some physiological changes to the brain, which is why what Mel is talking about can work. It's actually repatterning the brain, giving it different connections, because when you are rethinking a thought again and again and again, you literally create a path or a rut in your brain.
Yeah.
And it's just kind of like the marble rolling downhill. It's just real easy to go back into the rut. Yeah. So EMDR and some of these others build new connectors in your brain. Your brain is still growing and changing. That's what we mean. That's what scientists mean by plastic, not in the sense of stiff, but
neuroplasticity.
Neuroplasticity. Yeah. There we go. Look at that.
I want to speak to that point if I can, Karen.
Sure.
That's beautiful. I actually was just reading about that recently, how in PTSD, your brain can become so atrophied. Oftentimes people are like, I can't remember. So the hippocampus, that part of the brain that stores the memory, gets actually reduced in size. Well, the beauty with EMDR is that those MRI scans, if you have a before and after about 8 to 20 sessions of reprocessing in EMDR, there's a significance in the growth of the hippocampus.
Wow.
So it has in the past shrunk, but then it can grow back. The brain is amazing. It is amazing.
And that's by design. Your brain is amazing because you are fearfully and wonderfully made.
Amen.
And I think we really want there to be hope, because trauma is one of those things that has been like a sentence on someone's life.
Sure.
And brain health impacts family health, impacts the community, impacts generations. There's a whole thing on epigenetics, the way trauma actually can leave a mark on the DNA.
Yeah.
And they have seen this with the grandchildren of Holocaust survivors. And as best as the Holocaust survivor, and you see me if you're watching us on the live, I'm putting like a mask on my face, pretended as if that had never happened. Yet on the DNA of their children, their grandchildren, they would have anxiety, or they would have nightmares, or it was some kind of a mark. So God really does intend to heal, so that you can comfort others with the comfort that you yourself has received. That's kind of what that means. So EMDR is a great technique, and you are located in Virginia Beach.
Yes, correct.
But you do telehealth for this technique as well.
Yes, absolutely.
Important to know, because EMDR is a really good technique. Now, Mel will tell you when to use it and when not. That's her scope, not my scope. But we're going to talk about a couple other techniques that are really, really helpful. Some that I think you can do at home. Yeah. Because when you're in a trigger, all the adrenaline comes to the fore. The marble goes into the rut in the brain, right? Goes right downhill into the marble in the brain, right into the valley of the brain there. And it starts agitating it. And then you can't calm down.
Yeah.
And you're actually physically reliving it, which then is like almost like another injury. It's like pulling the scab off, and it's the injury. And to some extent, not fully, but a lot of times the healing process has to start again. So when we can intercept those, and you guys know I work in nutrition, and I have some products that I help people with that support the central nervous system and support brain health, so that the brain can recover more quickly, so that the adrenal glands can recover more quickly. And so this other cascade of things that can happen, we are holistic beings. We can offset. Can we talk a little bit about tapping. Tapping was something else you
Yeah.
mentioned to me. Is tapping the same as EFT or emotional freedom technique?
Yes, it is. Emotional freedom techniques, or tapping for short, because that's exactly what you're doing. You're tapping. What it is it's in a way similar to acupuncture. So we all have different pressure points in our body. But the cool thing about EFT is that we're not injecting a needle. It's just actually the own pressure of your hand that's going on different pressure points of your body. And for those that are live, I'll just demonstrate, tapping here, tapping
And she's
here.
tapping on her temple and on her head.
Yep. And then right here at the beginning of my eyebrow. And
Mm-hmm.
so these different pressure points, this one right here specifically, is related to the gut. And this
And
is
she's
related to
talking about, for those of you that are listening on the podcast, she's pointing to the top of her cheek, just under the eye,
yeah,
right?
yes, just under the eye. These are different meridians. So it's from the Chinese medicine, and the person that discovered this, or the theory is called thought field therapy. And then after further research, they realized if we can just create a simple recipe, which by recipe I just mean going through some of these different pressure points that I was just tapping on, and breathing, and having like a setup statement and then a balancing statement along with that, that really gives people a big drastic change in alleviating their anxiety, alleviating their symptoms of triggers or stress, all of the above. And it's wonderful to see like the shift happen right before your eyes, because different pressure points might mean something different to different people. I've had some people tell me that, hey, right here next to my eye on the temple, that just does something. Like I just feel something inside of me just shifting. And that's related to what it's healing and what it's doing in your own body. And to keep it simple, we can just tap on different points and just breathe. And that also taps into the mindfulness of, being aware of your breath and slowing down.
And that sounds a lot like, so just a couple of things with that. That is, it's almost like when women are in labor and they're breathing, they're distracting the brain from what's going on
Mm-hmm.
and staying in contact with your body. If you've ever heard of grounding,
Mm-hmm.
I remember just some of the things I would do when I was growing up. It was a little bit rough. And so when things were completely out of control and crazy, I didn't know what I was doing, but I would say, I see the clock on the wall. I mean, I was like 12, right?
Oh.
I see the clock on the wall. It's this time. The glass is over there. This person is standing here. The color of the room is. I was grounding myself.
That's amazing. You had great intuition.
Well, that was the Lord. That must have been the Lord.
Yeah.
I mean, when I was a little girl, I remember being 8 years old and sitting on my bed, and I just knew that I wasn't going to end up like the other adults I saw in my life. Now, I had a bit of a journey, and I struggled in some areas, but I did not end up the way some of these adults had. Now, that was the Lord, because little children don't know anything other than what they see.
Yeah.
So the purpose of grounding does two things. When someone is in a traumatic moment, whether they're experiencing it, think of your boss all of a sudden out of nowhere yelling at you about an assignment. That's like a little mini trauma. I'll just use that, right? You didn't expect it. You didn't see it coming. You had no way to prepare for it. Right?
Yeah.
So there's a part of you going, this is unreal. You're struggling with the fact that it's kind of unreal, right? Grounding, what that does for you is gives you that sense of self, that sense of agency, that sense of being able to distinguish your physical reality from that person's unreal behavior.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Grounding, some people just kind of go outside barefoot. Kind of tough to do in the winter in northern climes. But if you live down south, that's kind of the same thing, isn't it? Just because in trauma, can you address a little bit how oftentimes traumatized people, and it doesn't necessarily matter the type, sorry about that, gang. It doesn't necessarily matter the type of trauma.
Right.
But there's a sense of disconnectedness from their body.
Yeah.
And these body therapies reconnect and reintegrate us. Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. So to me, it sounds a little bit like window of tolerance. And to go with your example of, you walk into work and your boss kind of gives you a notice, or, I actually use that example a lot. But I kind of started way back. I started back with, you're at home, you wake up and you're like, I need a cup of coffee. You drop a little bit of coffee on your shirt. You don't have enough time to change. So that's one stressor, right? Then you're driving to work and you're like, oh man, this person isn't going fast enough. That's stressor number 2. And then by the time you get to work and you're late and your boss says something to you, like either you're at a place where you're like, okay, that's what, the broke the camel's back, or you've had so many grounding tools already that you're able to like bring yourself back into the present and orient yourself. So the window of tolerance means how many of these things that happen in our day to day, because Lord knows they happen every day, can you tolerate, so to speak, without going outside of your window of tolerance? The more you use these grounding techniques like breathing or tapping or other great positive resources, the wider and more expansive your window of tolerance gets. But if we don't know how to use these positive coping skills or these great resources, our window of tolerance might be small. And it might be that person after the cup of coffee and the stain on our shirt, that person that we're like stuck behind in traffic, might be that's the tipping point for us. So how can we further make that window even bigger and bigger? So we learn these tools, such as grounding, like Karen was talking about, and we add them to our clinical tool belt, not just like your tool belt for construction, but our, coping skills tool belt.
Right.
And we use them and we practice them on a daily, basis. And then we start to see, hey, my perspective on this situation can shift. Okay, so, my boss said something to me. Well, I'm going to, try harder. Or I'm going to have another perspective shift and say, you know what, maybe I can stay in a little bit longer today at work so that I can compensate for, what happened today and getting to work late.
And I think it's important. A couple of things. I want to talk a little bit about the rest of the Lord, because God intends for us to have a pretty decent sized window of tolerance, to use your word. That's a great phrase. So that's my new phrase.
Okay.
And what we're talking about with Mel Mossberger she is a licensed practical therapist.
Professional counselor.
I'm sorry. There's my brain.
It is all right.
But her focus is on trauma and helping people heal from it. You're listening to the Divine Healthy Living show, and we're talking about somatic healing, which is the bringing in of the healing of the body in order to heal the pain. And we see this when I work with somebody nutritionally. They might come to me. I had one woman, she said she was very depressed, and I can't do, beyond normal human empathy and some things for my own struggles, but I'm not a therapist in that regard. But we got her on a nutritional program. Mm-hmm. And she said, well, I just want to take, we have a St. John wort complex product. She goes, I just want to take that. I'm depressed. I said, well, we could do that, but then that's kind of like treatment. And what if you don't need that? What if it's something else? Let's do a foundation program, build up your whole body, give it all the tools it needs to function, and then see what happens. And I was in touch with her, and she said within about 6 weeks, she wasn't depressed.
Cool.
Her body was just running short on some things. So her window of tolerance was probably very narrow.
Yeah, there you go.
And it became broader. Your brain is an organ, and your brain runs on glucose, water, and sleep. So sleep is really, really huge. Sleep gets disruptive with trauma. The other thing I wanted to talk a little bit about, by the way, everything that Mel was talking will, for those of you that are suffering nightmares and those intrusive thoughts, it starts to reduce them as you heal. And then, by the way, just a little tip, when I would go to sleep, still do to this day, I would ask Jesus to be with me in my dreams. And because God still does speak to us in dreams. And so does the devil try to speak to us in dreams. And he takes the trauma damage and he like rides it the way a surfer rides a surf wave, rides a wave. And so I always ask the Lord to protect me in my dreams. I plead the blood of Christ. And then if I had nightmares, especially around the traumatic event, sometimes the Lord, I could tell, was helping me process through them, which was interesting. Write a dream journal, by the way. That's really good. That'll help you be able to tell what's maybe a trauma nightmare, what's maybe you're just processing and it's actually part of the healing. Let's talk a little bit about the rest of the Lord, because when we're talking about grounding.
Add a little piece to that?
Huh?
Okay? Can I add a little piece to that?
Yes, please do.
Yeah, so nightmares is a big topic in terms of trauma and anxiety, depression, all of the above. And so sleep hygiene is crucial. It's very important. And when you were mentioning about, just pleading the blood of Christ, that's absolutely amazing. I encourage people to, hey, what are those scriptures that stand out to you? Because there's scriptures really for every kind of situation. God thought of it all. So much, because that's really been our tool, is that we have the word to help guide us through all those moments. So I encourage people, hey, pick those verses that speak to you in regards to sleep, in regards to your dreams. And at nighttime, right before you're about to go to sleep, or right before you're about to go to bed, say those verses and do some grounding. Where are you? How are you feeling? How's the support of your bed? How's the support of the pillow? What are some things that you notice in your room? Maybe you notice something different. Point out colors in your room that you see. And after you've grounded yourself, and after you've, said those verses to yourself, then you can, go to sleep. And if you wake up because a nightmare happened, you wake up and you do the exact same thing. But I have definitely seen people tell me, hey, I rarely have nightmares. And it's a combination of that, like I was saying earlier, the biopsychosocial and spiritual. It's a spiritual component at human beings. We're not just one part. We're so many parts. So the spiritual component, and using that mental health component too, with that grounding piece.
That's exactly right. That's fantastic. And the other thing too is to remember that now, and if you're up, I'm not going to go off the rails too much down a rabbit trail, but if you're a prophetic person and the Lord speaks to you in dreams, your dreams are likely going to be far more vivid than somebody that the Lord does not primarily communicate with them that way. I have dreams. I can remember that from a teenager. I can remember the dream because the Lord often speaks to me in dreams, right? I don't get a word of knowledge that's maybe my fingers hurting like I know people that do, but my dreams have always been intense. And my husband would say, I don't even remember what I'm dreaming. And you're like, you can give me like detail after detail. So I journaled those in part. And journaling, by the way, is just good anyway. And part of what Mel is talking about when she talks about the grounding, and even when you're feeling disconnected from yourself from a dream or a trigger or what have you, it's staying present, because trauma always wants you to live in the past and fear the future. There's something called foreshortening. And what that means is, and if you've ever and trauma has lots of levels, so we're not always talking the most severe. You can just have a car accident that was like a fender bender, and you just kind of can't stop talking about it for a day or two. It's a little mini thing, right? But the next time you get in the car, you're a little extra concerned, you're not just more careful, you're actually maybe a little bit more fearful. And what foreshortening, pardon?
Hypervigilant, maybe.
Yeah, hypervigilant. And part of what foreshortening does, especially in a larger traumatic event in your life, is it tells you there's no more future. So that means by foreshorten, it's always going to be like this. You have no future. You have no future. I can't even plan 2 days from now, much less a year from now, is a sense of foreshortening. And so what Mel's talking about keeps you grounded in the present. Jesus is already in the future. He has already taken care of your past. He's with you now in the present, so it allows you to connect with God more.
Well, thank you. You taught me a new word, foreshortening.
There you go. It's once I heard that, it made a lot of sense, because when you, as a victim of trauma, somebody who's experienced it, who's survived and overcome, right? Those are stages, not identities. Right? Those are stages. Kind of like there's a zygote, an embryo, a fetus, which is Latin for little one, baby, right? They're all baby, different names for different stages. Is that and my brain just went off again. I went to Mexico on vacation. It's enjoying itself, and didn't let me know it was going there. The whole thing about, though, in the present with the Lord, trauma wants to take away your present. It wants to ruin what it can. Satan comes in on that and rides that. And that's why there's an obligation, I think, to heal. I once heard it described this way, because there's also, we're not going to get into the whole side of forgiveness and bitterness, which are part of that healing. But I heard it described this way. Somebody may have hit you with a car and you broke your leg, but now you're responsible for the healing of your leg, even though you weren't responsible for the accident.
Yeah.
And it matters not only in your personal life, but the lives of those around you.
Yeah.
Especially if you're a parent with children, but even if you're not, your brothers, your sisters, family members, your community, your workplace depend on a healed you.
Yeah.
They really depend on a healed you. So let's talk a little bit about the rest of the Lord, because that's what Sabbath means. And it's a place of trust. One of the things that happens when we're in trauma is our trust is obliterated.
Unfortunately.
Yeah, because especially in a big trauma, you had lightning strike. So don't tell me lightning doesn't strike. I've had lightning strike. I've seen what it looks like, and I now believe lightning strikes more frequently than anybody admits. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So how would you help somebody build their faith?
Yeah.
Through healing? Because I think if the person who can trust that the Lord is protecting them, they might have felt unprotected or abandoned by him. And that's part of trauma, is this sense of abandonment. Don't mean to go too deep. We just kind of are.
Yeah. So part of what happens with trauma is that there's a little bit of a new version of yourself. And the challenge comes when you have to process what happened and what is going on in the present. So what I'm getting at is a new version of who you are, and you're grieving the loss of who you are not anymore, whatever loss that may look like. In other plain terms speaking, loss of your virginity, loss of a spouse, all kinds of losses. So the trauma healing process can be like a grieving process. And for that, there's, I think, about 5 stages. So at times you might feel like you're having a better day, but then the next day you might be really angry because you remembered something. Then the next day you might feel sad. And so I encourage people to have grace for yourself. Now, I've said this to people before, and some people kind of look at me like, what does that even mean? Other people like, okay, I think I kind of get that. What do I mean by have grace for yourself? I mean, we're going to miss the mark. Whether one day you have a good day and you have this expectation that tomorrow is going to be a good day because today was, but then out of nowhere, something reminds you about that piece that still hurts. It's okay to be in that moment and acknowledge that moment for what it is. Hey, this is sad. And it kind of hurts, because if we don't acknowledge it and we press it down or suppress it, what we're doing is we're not giving ourselves that gift of healing. We need to heal in those bits and pieces when they come up. Healing is a whole continuum. It doesn't happen in stages. You don't go from 1 to 2 to 3, just like with grieving. You don't go from like bargaining to sadness to anger. No, you bounce back and forth throughout all those stages. And so that's why I say have grace for yourself. If one day you're so upset and you're upset at yourself because, like, why are you here? Why are you here again? And you thought that you were past that. You thought that you were over that. God has given us so much grace. God understands that we were going to be going through all these moments. As Karen was saying, he knows our future and he knows our past. But guess what? He's right beside us in our present. And in that present moment, just sit in his lap, hold on to his hand, and just let him know how you feel. This is how I feel. This is how I am. God is so amazing because we can be real with him. And he will just listen. He's the ultimate therapist. I mean, forget me as a professional counselor. He's the ultimate therapist here. He will listen to you yell at him, scream, bloody murder scream, because those are also healing, crying, all the things, the letters that you write, he will read those. He'll listen to you as you process through all these things. So when you're having a day that you don't expect to have, that's what I go back to. Have grace for yourself.
And remember, to your point about writing, the scripture says, and depending on your version, I like the one that says he collects all of our tears in a bottle. And another one says he records all of them. So I think the important thing, though, is we're constantly encouraged in the scripture to not look back. And part of healing is looking back less and less. And I know in my own healing, there were times where I just had to say, I don't have to look at that anymore. Just because I'm used to looking at it doesn't mean I have to. And if what Jesus says is true, the most radical thing I can do is act as if. I don't have to bring it up anymore. I certainly don't need to wear it as a badge. Because when I think, well, we'll just keep that for maybe another conversation, because that'll take us down another rabbit hole. But the rest of Christ, developing in the faith that God does protect you, the faith that he is there with you, because one of the things about trauma is it feels very raw. And we don't always see where God is in that. But over time, those scriptures that maybe you're just repeating to yourself because you don't know what else to do with them. If you allow the Lord, the Holy Spirit, he will bring meaning and understanding in them. He'll start to show you. And that's, comes from, go on.
I have those conversations with God. Oftentimes I ask, hey, what does God say about that? Who cares what I think? Don't ask me as the client who would look to me. What do you think? What does God think? Hey, what is God saying in that moment when that happened? Or what is God saying in this current moment? And use that self-reflection. Keep it that open conversation, because God will speak to you, whether it's just a sense of peace, whether it's a direction, whether it's a revelation, or even, as Carol was saying, even through dreams. I mean, he builds us in ways where he has this special connection with each of us. And maybe your special connection is through dreams. Maybe your special connection is through prayer. It's different for every person, but keep that open communication and check in with him. Hey, God, what do you think about this? What does this say about me through the lens of how God sees you? Oftentimes we say, what does this say about me? And then maybe the lens is through like the worldview. But if we think about it through how does God see me? That's a whole new perspective, because how does God see us? He calls us his beloved. He calls us children. We're heirs of Christ. And if we start believing those truths, then we start to integrate that into our story of those trauma pieces that happen, that despite the hardships, despite the bitter, the tears and all that, we are still those truths, children of God, heirs of Christ, and all those other amazing truths.
That's right. That's so fantastic. And I want to just, as we've gone a little bit over, but it's been so valuable. And I hope that all of you have really been blessed by this. And you can see that Mel's heart and my heart is to really bring you to a place that you can move forward in life, whether that's through a tiny stressor you're tempted to get stuck in, or whether that's one of those very big what's called a life-defining moment, but it doesn't have to define your future. Right? And if you really, I love to study overcomers, because when you study them, like this missionary I referred to, she was able to use that, and that experience that the Lord, we're just going to use the word permitted without getting into all the theology of that, in her life and bringing her through that, broke the hearts of the people. And they said, my gosh, if she suffered like that, let's listen to her about her Christ. And she saw that as bearing the marks, the suffering of Jesus, because it broke the barriers in that particular people group. So also to, all things work together for good.
Amen.
Right? For those who are called according to his purpose. So we've talked a little bit about somatic healing, which is the healing of your body and the body memory. In the show notes, and for those of you looking at this in Facebook, in the show notes, if you're on the podcast, which is on Spotify, you can get it through Apple, you can get it through all the major podcast players. You'll see the link to Mel's website. If not, reach out to me. I'll pass it on to you. But it's getting in touch with your body. However you do that, walking barefoot in the grass, in the trees, actually is very helpful. The tapping that she talked about, the EMDR, she's a licensed provider of that. That's really, and I know people who've done EMDR, and it really took maybe cognitive, by the way, as when is talking through it, but sometimes it just stripped away the pain of the memory, and they processed it, and in effect didn't really need to talk about it. Would that be your experience?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, so it really shortened down the healing time in a meaningful way. So as we're wrapping up the Divine Healthy Living show, guys, I want to thank you so much for joining us. Thank you, Melanie Mossberger, licensed professional therapist. You got it. Counselor. That's what LPC is. That's what LPC. What is CTTS?
Certified Trauma Treatment Specialist.
There you are. She's a certified trauma treatment specialist. LPC can also be licensed professional corporation. And so my brain was kind of going back and forth between that. But please do reach out to her, especially if you want a Christian faith-based approach to trauma healing, which I very strongly recommend. Remember that the Lord wants you to live in shalom. And the more that you take care of your physical body, the more you see the pieces of your spiritual health, your mental health, come into alignment. Thank you so much for joining us today, Mel.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. I've enjoyed this chat. And thank you for everybody that's watching. My website is newmerciescounselingvb.com.
newmerciescounselingvb.com, and that'll be in the show notes. Thanks again, everybody, and shalom. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.